Yeah, it's interesting when you started talking about this idea that they wanted to dominate space and also prevent other countries from being able to do what they want to in space. That immediately brought to mind the South China Sea to me as well, because it's not just about claiming sovereignty over these islands, right? They're trying to keep the Philippines from being able to resupply their, islands that they claim. They're trying to maybe control the global shipping environment in the South China Sea. So that is
Yeah.
definitely pretty scary.
Yeah, because the moon is the next step in any country's like space exploration. If China can deny access to the moon,
It isn't just about exploration, it's about utilization. Back in 2015, the US passed a space resource law, which basically says any private citizen who goes to the moon or the asteroid or comet and harvests, water ice, regolith, minerals, whatsoever, that becomes they can take possession of that and sell it. Now, the Russians immediately jumped right on it, hated it, and they keep on being against it. And slowly it's becoming what I call customary international law, or customary interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. The Chinese have been really quiet about it, but in a sense they've been kind of accepting about it. And the problem with that is that China talks about its quote commercial space industry, but really they don't have a commercial space industry because any private company in China has government ownership to it. So here's a scenario, and I've actually fleshed this out before to the media. I'm a quote commercial Chinese company. I go to the moon and I start harvesting mineral materials there. Now, but that's all well and good. However, I got to remember that that Chinese company is still really, in a sense, an extension of the Communist Party in China. And basically, they are, in a sense, they are extending sovereignty not only over those minerals that they're harvesting, but they're also potentially claiming sovereignty over the actual plot where they are actually harvesting the minerals from. In other words, they're violating the Outer Space Treaty, or in other words, rewriting the Outer Space Treaty. Or better yet, they're invalidating the non sovereignty principle in the Outer Space Treaty by doing so.
Is that why you think China landed Chang'e 4 on the dark side of the moon? Because they wanted to, because the U.S. hasn't been to that region, right? So China can say, oh, we're the first to this region. And then maybe 10, 20, 100 years from now, they can say, oh, well, we were the first to this region. So therefore we claim this part of the moon. They get the whole far side of the moon.
I think it's part of the reason. In other words, national pride, and to promote them, promote the stuff as these great, leaders in outer space. There is a geopolitical aspect to this, to their space program as well. They want to have other countries to join with them because of their quote technical prowess, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of it. But however, landing and physically occupying the territory, I believe, is a first step in actually acquiring and invalidating this whole idea of non-sovereignty in the Outer Space Treaty and start laying claims to it. It's very interesting, but I always say that I've always said to people that the South China Sea, this is a dry run for outer space.
it's really interesting because, like in the South China Sea, they call it salami slicing. That sort of drip, drip, drip pressure, and you already see that with space because I think a lot of people hear these things and are like, I don't buy this. I don't care. This is all future stuff. And so they don't get pushback. And it's already that drip, drip, drip is beginning. And then.
Or I think there's also this way that it's hard to push back on what looks like space exploration.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's this whole idea of space exploration as like, oh, like a noble thing that countries should be doing and participating in, and somehow also the idea that it crosses borders and brings countries
it's the
together.
End of history stuff.
Like, yeah, because for many years after the Soviet Union fell, like Russia and the US were working together on space stuff, right? Even though they were competing so much before. So then there's the idea that like we should all be able to cooperate in space. So then when China starts like putting, astronauts in space and like doing all this kind of stuff, it becomes hard to be like, wait a minute, what are they doing? Like it becomes difficult to object to things that look like on the surface, like what NASA does or
because
what other
then it
countries
comes
do.
back to, it's the U.S. being the aggressor and just trying to take over space for themselves.
Exactly. And you hear about this whole thing about cooperation. The PRC laments, we got to have more cooperation. In fact, there is a law an appropriations law called the Wolf Amendment that prevents NASA from cooperating with China. And it's a good thing because fundamentally they want technology. They want access to technology. That's basically cooperation. I look at cooperation as, you know what, it isn't so much it looks like it's a nice political optic. You got to understand, what am I really getting out of this? Besides warm and fuzzy feelings, and what are they getting out of it? Because they're obviously going to get more than warm and fuzzy feelings out of it.
I don't imagine the Communist Party ever really looks for warm and fuzzy feelings.
But they have a very good. They project a very good face. I mean, look at social media, TikTok especially. They are very effective in factualizing it. We're talking about we're getting astronauts back on the moon and why this is important, and it's important, and it's important for two reasons. One, the ones who get there first and actually start developing get to make the rules. But two, we got to preserve the history as well. We got to say we're back and we're here, and all this history back 50 some odd years ago when we landed human beings on the world, that is valid history. If the PRC gets there and starts developing beforehand, they're in a good position to basically invalidate that history and say it never existed.
Like, in other words, the moon, they're going to invalidate the actual moon landing, like say it was, produced in the studio by Stanley Kubrick.
Exactly. They can use social media is very powerful, and they use it very effectively. Like through TikTok, for example, they can basically say, well, all these things, they can say, well, the moon landings were faked, it never happened. And with the generation that's hooked into this, they're likely going to take that as fact, and the PRC could effectively erase history of the moon landings during the Apollo program.
That is actually a very interesting point because we had someone on recently talking about how after the October 7th attack on Israel, TikTok was pushing out a lot of like very pro-Palestinian content. And then like as the Apex summit came up, it reduced that. So that seems like it's something the Chinese Communist Party was pushing. Like actually, because a new generation of Americans, they don't know anything about this conflict. If most young Americans are getting all of their news from this Chinese-controlled platform, that's very dangerous.
It's part of the three warfares. It's the media aspect of the three warfares they're using.
No, I mean, I'm also thinking about like Hollywood movies and The Martian, right? Which is probably one of the biggest space movies to come out in years. And then there's that whole idea that like essentially like the Chinese space program is coming in and saving the day.
Wasn't that also a part of Gravity too?
I didn't watch Gravity, so.
Yes, Sandra Bullock got over to the Chinese space station, I believe it was, and took one of their capsules and got back to Earth. And I'll just tell you right now, Mark Watney, no matter what he said, he wasn't really a space pirate legally.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, you are the expert on space law, so there we go. He's not a pirate.
So what is a space pirate, and how does one become a space pirate if one were interested in such a thing?
There's no legal statute on the book for what constitutes space piracy. There is something for piracy on the high seas, but not for outer space. And given the way the outer space treaty is written, I'm sorry, it may have made Mark Watney feel better about himself, but he wasn't a space pirate legally.
So it's actually impossible to be a space pirate currently.
Well, right now it is until we come up with some rules about it. But that's decades away, so I'm not worried about it.
I'm beginning to plan decades into the future. Now, a big thing that's always talked about whenever we're talking about space weapons is space debris. We know China has been very successful at launching anti-satellite missiles, blowing up its own craft and creating space debris, which is a very potentially dangerous thing. Can you tell us about why that is such a concern and how China might leverage that?
Well, I'm more concerned about upper stages than I am about ASAT tests.
What's the difference? I'm curious about why.
The difference is upper stages are these big things, and if you don't make sure they're properly defueled and the battery is discharged, the extremes of the environment could make them go boom, and they can make much more debris than a destructive ASAT test. It's a very big concern, and the Russian Federation and the PRC are the biggest offenders when it comes to that. Another thing on space debris, last year when they were launching the modules on their Heavenly Palace space station, they were basically using a single stage to orbit this big, large booster that was actually spinning around the Earth uncontrollably, and nobody knew it was going to come down. And they did that about 3 or 4 times in order to get all the modules assembled up there. And it was a big concern because they didn't know where they was going to land. And if it landed, if it landed in my backyard and actually it flew over my area a few times, they would have been liable for the damage under international law. Now, it would have been a big fight to get them to admit it and get them to pay up for it, but they would have been liable for it, and not to mention the potential, for injury or death that might have occurred from it. Now, I'm going to be upfront with you. There's been no reported injuries or death from falling space debris. You're going to hear a lot about that with relation to Starlink, but that's never happened. So I'm just going to get that right out in front and make that disclosure. But as far as ASAT tests, yeah, they're spectacular from a psychological standpoint, in my opinion. But in the grand scheme of larger space debris, upper stages are really a much more bigger concern. The U.S. companies like ULA and SpaceX, they basically, in most cases, defuel their upper stages and set them on a course where they're going to re-enter within a reasonable amount of time. But the PRC and the Russians are a lot less prudent when it comes to disposing of their upper stages, and it's a big concern.
Why do they do that?
Because it would take either extra fuel or extra resources on their part to actually make sure that the upper stage basically re-enters, doesn't become a hazard in the future.
Well, wouldn't that just be as dangerous for them as it is for anybody and make any future space operations more difficult?
But again, we're thinking like Westerners, and this is the issue I have with a lot of colleagues who work for NGOs who are in academia, is they think the PRC should be just as concerned about these things as we are. But culturally, they're a lot different than we are. It's called mirror thinking, and it's a very bad thing to get into. And a perfect example of this in the space weapon debate is, you've seen a lot of generals come up in the past few years and saying, in a space war, nobody wins. Well, that isn't true. From the perspective of the PRC, there can be winners in this. In fact, even in nuclear war, during the Cold War, the Soviets believed in some cases a nuclear war could be won, and that was the premise they operated on. While we operated on nobody wins, and that was our strategy. Thankfully, it worked. But again, we got to think they have a different culture, and if you look back in their history, I mean, it's brutal as being nice to say. Their culture was, violence. Brutality was paramount in their culture. It was part of that, and they remember their history. So they don't think in terms of niceties of like, oh, we got to preserve the environment. I hate to say they don't care, but they're not as cognizant as as the Western world is, because we have NGOs and we have laws, and we take into account the environment in terms of that. But again, in terms of them saying, well, a war, nobody wins in a war. Well, it depends on how you define winning, and I believe they define winning differently than we do. In other words, you can win if winning is making the other guy, not use the space asset.